because in the grand scheme of things, the GFC did not last a super long period of time, at least relative to the life of a private equity firm. Those PE firms, even the Walking Deads, were able to rehabilitate themselves in a lot of different ways coming out of the GFC. And in certain cases, not only were they able to recover, but they were able to go out there and raise substantially larger funds.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Welcome to the Small Business Mentor podcast, where we shine a light on the black holes of business growth with your host, Alan Pence. In each episode, we explore the leaps and bounds entrepreneurs make as they push their businesses beyond the 1 million mark into the realm of professional sustainable growth. Stay with us as we navigate the journey from brute force to finesse.
Today on the pod, we have very special guest, Steve Wiesner. He is both, we were just talking about this, he's both a Canadian and an American, and a PE guy, former PE guy, and now a small business owner. So he is divided against himself in multiple places. So happy, and we're recording this on Canada Day. So happy Canada Day, and thanks for coming on the pod, Steve.
Thank you very much, sir. I appreciate that. Happy to be here. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so Steve, your main company now is Watershed Associates. So why don't we talk a little bit about, your journey into buying a small business and what it does, and then we'll touch on the PE stuff after.
Sure, absolutely. Let's start with what it does. That's the easy part because the journey is a little bit more convoluted. But Watershed has been around now for nearly 30 years. It is a company that has been focused on negotiations training and only negotiations training since the very beginning, primarily procurement and supply chain focused in terms of our client base. But we've worked with companies and organizations around the world. We've worked with everyone from NASA and the FDA, OMB on the government side, to Chevron and Halliburton and Medtronic on the corporate side, and delivered in 40 countries. So it's a small business, but we are very global in our focus. Multi-language capability as well, and facilitators increasingly spread around the world. So it's a really nice little company. How we got here is a very, again, convoluted story that probably goes beyond the scope of our conversation today. But the quick and dirty of it is I became an entrepreneur a little bit over 10 years ago. 2012, end of 2012 into 2013 is when this journey began. Started off actually starting a business. So originally I started a software company. That was the catalyst for me making the shift. Building software that was used to facilitate M&A deals for middle market investment banks, private equity firms, lenders, et cetera. Different way to market those transactions. And one thing led to another. Again, I'll spare you the gruesome details now. That business did not end up being successful, but probably around 2017 or so, we started our pivot into the training world. And that's where Peloton Document Solutions became Peloton RPM, and learned a whole bunch throughout that journey as well. That training business was more sales focused, sort of sales training, leadership, communication. And that business is still around, but Watershed has become the lion's share of what we do. And that acquisition was closed on August 29th of 2022. So almost 2 years ago.
Great. And give it any details about like how many employees, revenue, margins. What can you tell us about on Watershed?
I never go into details on the latter two, but we're around 20 people now spread around the globe. So again, small business. And the team has grown tremendously over the past couple of years since we've invested. And more growth to come. We got some really exciting things coming in terms of, again, new facilitators and new markets. A lot of good stuff happening. So it's been thankfully, it's been a very successful transaction thus far.
Great. And so the model is in-person delivery. Talk a little bit about the model for the delivery of training.
It's a great question. The answer is absolutely yes. The reason it is such a great question is because, again, I spent a bunch of years of my life in the software business and have always had this interesting thought process in my mind about merging technology together with live facilitation. There's a lot of interesting debates that go on in the training industry about software only solutions versus live on-prem in-person delivery. We at Watershed are massively focused on the latter. And again, I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole because I could start geeking out over training. My personal view is, I think, especially in an AI driven world, so much of the value that gets delivered through training is experiential. And especially when you're focusing on negotiations, for instance, as we do, where at least until the robots take over and put all of us into 6 feet under, we are negotiating with people, having that face to face or virtual. We deliver virtually as well, but having the live workshops, live learning experiences, I actually think is a tremendous differentiator. So certainly we're integrating technology into our delivery. We've got e-learning. We're building out some tremendous e-learning capabilities as well for pre-workshop, post-workshop, but live will continue to be the cornerstone of what we do. I think that's really what allows us to add as much value as we have for all these years.
And your kind of engagement, is it something where you'll engage with a company for a long period of time? Or is it like, hey, I'm going to, I do like a 2-month project? Like, how do the contracts usually work?
We historically have sold workshops, and often there will be batches of workshops that get bought. When you're dealing primarily with Fortune 250 style companies, they often buy in bulk. And this is one of the reasons that we are global in our delivery, is because when you're working with some of these organizations, they've got people scattered all over the world. And so we need to be able to deliver effectively all over the world. So often we'll have clients who will buy a batch of workshops to be executed over the course of a year, but 90% of our clients still are repeat customers. So we've dealt with some of these clients going back to literally 2001. Chevron's a great example of that. A lot of our clients we've worked with for a decade plus, in certain cases 2 decades plus. And so even though we are selling kind of an annual bucket of or basket of workshops, they tend to come back year after year.
Right. So it's just like new employees come in, they want to get them trained too. And that's interesting. So it's sort of like recurring purchases, but it's not really recurring revenue. It's, a little different, like in the service world.
All this discussion about recurring versus reoccurring, right? For us, it is reoccurring. And as we do introduce more technology, obviously that hopefully will become more recurring contractually as well with the e-learning that we're building out. So I would like to introduce a little bit of a truly recurring model as well.
Yeah. So I was going to ask about customer acquisition, but it sounds like it came with the business, and it just, 90% is existing clients. There's, that's pretty nice.
It is nice, and it's real. Look, when you're doing diligence on these deals, as we all know, you always wonder a little bit about what you're buying, as we should. We were blessed with some wonderful sellers who, to this very day, they're amazing people. And what we saw is what we got. There really have not been any surprises with the business, and including that recurring customer dynamic, which we were assured was the case, but of course you can't take them at face value, but that has been the case. But now the challenge is to really scale the business. Number one, we need to be going deeper within these organizations. These are huge companies. We could be selling multiples of what we're selling today. That's strategic priority number one, but certainly new logo acquisition as well. But often, interestingly enough, in terms of customer acquisition, the new logo acquisition is actually driven by the diaspora. So we'll have a learner who does a workshop at Halliburton, and then they go to another energy company and we get a phone call. And that happens with frequency.
That's awesome. So you had an existing structure, right, from this Peloton and the previous attempt at the software company. And did that structure then move into this new company, or did you buy it yourself, or what was that?
Yeah, we bought it ourselves. It's a very different business than what we were doing through Peloton. And I'll spare you the details in terms of what we did at Peloton that truly was very differentiated in terms of simulation training, et cetera. Not super applicable to what we're doing at Watershed. So Watershed, I bought completely separately from Peloton. Very different business, very different model, different customer base, pretty much top to bottom, separate and distinct.
And you're the operator? like the CEO.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay. And okay, so interesting. So talk to me a little bit about on X SMB Twitter, where we've interacted before. You write a lot about the myths of small business buying, and so I think obviously some of these probably came from your acquisition of Watershed. So talk a little bit about some of the things that you see commonly said that you kind of challenge, push back on.
That's the funny part, Alan, is that I think people, and I understand why, on SMB Twit sort of look at me as being the grumpy old man on the lawn, right? Or yelling at clouds about how, you whippersnappers need to be thinking about this, the doom and gloom. Interesting enough, that hasn't been driven by Watershed. And sincerely and genuinely, I can't tell you how happy I have been with this acquisition. So when people characterize me as being kind of anti-ETA or anti-SM, I could not be further pro-ETA and pro-SMB. But I think going through the incredibly painful and protracted experience with the software company has utterly opened my eyes, traumatized me, PTSD'd me, whatever the expression may be. And to a certain extent, scared the bejesus out of me in a way that I think is very positive for my experience with Watershed, and hopefully will be positive for the experiences of people who are looking to buy businesses on SMB Twitter or through SMB Twitter. So I think even though, again, that was a build versus buy, a lot of the same pitfalls, a lot of the same painful lessons that I learned over the course of many, many years that I think are applicable, and I think help me come up with these sort of myths or things that people buying a small business need to be really concerned about. And the good news with Peloton was I didn't PG anything. There was no SBA loan involved. It was just a straight up startup. But I had investors. I had invested a lot personally, both directly financially and certainly in terms of opportunity cost. So the failure of that business profoundly impacted me in a lot of ways. And hopefully other people can benefit from hearing about those experiences.
I think you've mentioned like you didn't shut it down soon enough, right? So drain more cash and time than you should have. So is that the primary lesson there?
There are so many that we could talk about, and discussing these things is cathartic to me, like selfishly. I think that's the other thing that I personally love about Twitter is that it really is like me talking to a therapist, I guess, in certain ways. It's just my therapist is however many thousands of followers that are out there who actually pay attention to my stuff. I think let's focus on the one that you mentioned, because I think that is a great place to start, which is knowing when to say when. I think so many of us from a very early age are instilled with this never quit mentality that starts with, youth sports. And there's so many examples with kids where it's, you will not quit, you will not quit. And that carries over into your role as an entrepreneur. And you've got to be really careful about that, because then that merges together with sunk cost fallacy and a lot of other things that start to instill themselves into your brain. Just, ego, all these things that start to pull together that I think often inhibit us, if not prevent us altogether from making tough decisions and looking in the mirror and having an honest conversation with ourselves, with our families and loved ones, with our colleagues, with our investors. This isn't working. And the conversation that I did cite on Twitter once that sticks with me is one of my investors, who's a dear friend, once telling me, you've kept this business open out of guilt. And to this day, that statement emotionally impacts me, because there was a lot of truth to that. Not guilt because there was any wrongdoing or anything like that. It just didn't work. And I think that's a second takeaway is with friends and family money, and largely this was a friends and family money deal. We had a strategic come in and invest later on, but it was largely friends and family financed. That also just creates a tremendous emotional burden that I think people often underestimate, because when you're raising that money, you believe with every fiber of your being that this thing is going to be the next Tesla, right? It's going to go to the moon. And So when it finally dawns on you that not only did that not happen, but that the business is going to fail, you fight like hell to try to make it work any way you can. And often that's just a very bad decision. So I would argue that never quit in many respects is very bad advice. There are times where the sooner you detect that you have to quit, frankly, the better.
One of the other things you've written about is that when you personally guarantee debt, maybe your options to quit are a lot more constrained, right? So at least in a venture style, the reason you're taking venture style risk is because you're using other people's money, right? And you're not using guaranteed debt. So I think the caution is really, hey, don't be taking anywhere near that level of risk if you're buying a company with that kind of debt.
Well, I think where that comes together as well, and I know there's a lot of sort of controversy or discussion on Twitter regarding what the default rates actually mean when it comes to 7A loans. And some people appropriately lock onto the fact that you cannot default and still have a terrible personal outcome with these loans. And you could be burning through personal savings just to make those payments, despite the fact that business, for all intents and purposes, is defunct. There's a lot of things that happen that you can and will do to prevent those defaults from happening that can have a materially negative impact on your financial position, your life. And again, one of many reasons that people need to take those PGs incredibly seriously. And that's not to, this is one thing where I think I do cross the line sometimes. Sometimes I think I write in a way that implies that people who are about to sign a PG are not taking it seriously. These people, of course, are taking it seriously. They're taking it deadly seriously. They're not idiots. I think the problem becomes, again, we delude ourselves as entrepreneurs. We are inherently wired to be optimistic. And at that stage in particular, we're so excited about the potential that we've convinced ourselves of. Again, every fiber of our being, we believe that it's going to be successful. You need to strip those biases away and be really cold and calculating about what the real risks are before you sign on that dotted line.
Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of confusion. Like, so you mentioned ETA, entrepreneurship through acquisition. And I think there's multiple versions of that phenomenon, right? And so I think the traditional version was, hey, I'm graduating from Stanford Business School and I'm going to go get a bunch of investors and buy a big business and then try to grow it, right? And that was one form of ETA. Then you have the independent sponsor, or individual searcher going out and using SBA debt that's personally guaranteed. And so they're all grouped together. And so I think sometimes when people criticize aspects of ETA, they take it as the entire enterprise, whereas maybe it's just they're versions of it that are much riskier than other versions, right?
100%. Yes, no question. And it's funny, back in 2001 into 2002, I guess the beginning of 2002 is when this started. Just as I was coming out of banking, from 2002 until 2005, I teamed up with a wealthy family office and a private equity firm to go out there and bird dog deals. So to a certain extent, I was a searcher / independent sponsor / finder, whatever the label was. And even back then, even teamed up with legit sources, deep pockets of capital, was still really difficult to get a deal done. And I think that's the other thing that often people, regardless of the basket they come from in that ETA world, sometimes people just underestimate. It can not only take you 12 months to find, it could take you years to find a deal. So that's another thing. Do you have the runway to maintain discipline? That's the key thing, is that the longer you're at it, the bigger the risk that you're going to start to make suboptimal decisions because you're getting hungry and desperate. Can't do that. That's a dangerous mix.
Well, I think that that's probably the truest thing I've heard about this entire phenomenon. And I really do see that all the time. I mean, you just want to get something done, right? Buying small businesses is not the place to just get something done, right? I mean, I guess if you have a big private equity fund behind you, you can take a little bit of losses, but when you're doing it on your own.
Because you got management fees, you got a portfolio. There's a lot of different economic.
Right, right. Even then, there's a lot of risk, but I do think what you see is like a lot of times. My take is the people who really do it well are incredibly. Some are lucky, but they're incredibly determined people, right? And they really drive to that. But I do think the model, like recently, I've been hearing from people talk to some people at this Capital Camp conference I was just at. And essentially what happens is everybody who kind of invests in search funds, like if they really start doing it regularly, they end up becoming a private equity firm because the search model doesn't really scale very well for them. And once they start, so one of the inefficiencies of search, I think, is that this person spends all this time drumming up all these deals and they only buy one, right? And then they shut down all the other stuff. So private equity, will keep on all the other deals as well. So it just becomes more efficient in the long run to just stick with the private equity model rather than funding the searchers themselves. So it's kind of a strange model, and I don't think it's going to scale much beyond what it is right now. But I could be wrong.
It is interesting. And I think I posted something, actually, I guess one of my better sort of, and that's not saying very much, but my attempts at humor on Twitter a couple weeks ago about the fact that I do think, and maybe this will allow us to move into the topic with regards to PE generally. I do think sometimes I just want to grab some of these folks by the shoulders and shake them and say, stop playing make-believe that you're a private equity firm. Because you got a lot of folks on Twitter who very appropriately point out a lot of negative aspects of the private equity model, especially when it comes to this world. And yet they basically, for all intents and purposes, look and sound as if they're a private equity firm. And I don't know if that's irony or not, but it's striking sometimes, the disconnect there, because I think searchers do have such a wonderful opportunity to position themselves as the anti-PE buyer. And yet they call themselves Stone Rock Capital or whatever it may be. And and I fell into this trap myself. I mean, going all the way back again to 2002, Zuma Capital Partners was my firm. Now, granted, back then, PE didn't have the bad name that it sometimes is painted with today. But I think today there's a really good opportunity for searchers to market themselves as the opposite of a PE buyer. And they not only shouldn't shy away from that, they should step into that aggressively.
Before we go fully into PE, though, I wanted to hit two other things. So two things that I think maybe cut a little bit against what we were just talking about. As you said, one of the myths is don't buy a job and always buy big. So talk a little bit about why you put those out there.
I want to be cautious about the way that I word this, right? Because this does also relate to the fact that there are different shades of ETA and there's different objectives that different people have. Part of it is driven by the fact that I do think that for first-time buyers, I get very nervous about them stepping into a larger organization where they haven't established credibility because they haven't built knowledge and it's clear for all to see. And the reason, of course, that bothers me is even if you are not ultimately going to be the quote unquote operator, you need to be able to engage within those organizations from a position of authority. And the best way to do that is to have proven experience that you can cite to help people understand why you want to make the changes, for instance, that you want to make. And especially in people-driven businesses, establishing that credibility is incredibly critical to managing a change management process successfully. That's number one. Number two is complexity. It's just, I think it is, generally speaking, a good rule to follow that the larger the organization, the more complexity there's going to be. But I think there's another aspect to it as well. And I did tweet about this recently, which is in this world, a lot of people tend to talk about businesses doing a couple $1 million of EBITDA as being quote unquote larger deals or more sophisticated. And my response was, dude, I have seen companies with $5 or $10 million of EBITDA that are operational basket cases. And so if you're stepping into it thinking that you're buying IBM when you're buying a business doing 3.5, you're not thinking clearly. And I would actually argue sometimes those smaller businesses, at least it's easier to implement the changes. It's easier to see where the opportunities lie. I think there's benefit to going small in the early stages for a lot of people, not everybody, but for a lot of people.
Yeah, exactly. And given that you can manage the risks of, you don't have to take the debt, right? So I think that's smart. The other thing I see is I've been hearing this. Have you heard of that guy? I think it's Jason Ishbia, who's a kind of he's specialized in private equity of small companies, and he's been on a bunch of podcasts recently. And so basically, what they've done is they build out a thesis in a area. So we think veterinary hospitals or whatever it is are going to be big, and then they recruit a board first for acquisitions, and made up of experts in the industry. And then they do hire, more traditional PE. But they hire inexperienced, younger CEOs, first time. But a lot of times they've had experience in that industry. They just haven't been CEO, but they could be younger. But then they put them into an acquisition, and they have this first of all, they have the thesis of and the game. There's kind of a playbook of what we think will make the thesis work in the companies. So they've got a playbook, and then they've got this experienced board that's done everything in the industry, right? So to me, if I were this younger person without the experience, I would be looking for the setups like that, or like some of these search funds will put people into their businesses or something like that, where you can get maybe a flavor of running the company without taking the risk and get some experience, and then go buy your own company, afterwards.
And I think that approach sounds great. And I'm not familiar with Jason, but I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think that there are a lot of things that you can do to mitigate the risk. I just don't think a lot of people necessarily are thinking about all of those things, which is why this sounds like a creative approach. Having a good board can be worth its weight in gold. It can obviously also introduce a level of dysfunction depending on how that board gets patched together. I think we've all experienced that at some point in time in our past. So you do need to be careful, but the more expertise you can inject to a situation like that, the better, clearly.
I think someone told me once, hey, if you're going to go try to build some like holdco, just assume you're not Warren Buffett. So I think there is a little bit of this where like there are some outstanding examples of people who have been young, had no experience, did it right, bought right, and had a great outcome. But let's just assume that you're not going to have all those things lined up for you before you go in. Right?
That's another one that I've caught some fire over with regards to holdcos and roll-ups. And if you have never bought a business in your life, it is absolutely fine, even admirable for you in the back of your head to think, yeah, and I'm going to do this, and then I'll go and I'll buy 4 more. Leave number 2, 3, and 4, even any open discussion of number 2, 3, 4 for later on down the road when you've actually proven you can do 1. And that always is a little bit of a sore spot for me. Reg Zeller and I have gone back and forth a couple times on Twitter about this, and I'm not against roll-ups. I'm just against people who learned the term 6 months ago, sort of casting it about as if this is just an easy model to execute. That's what I'm against. And I think just people need to, having been old enough to see a lot of these things blow up and the cycle's gone bad in the past, there's a lot of complexity and a lot of danger there. So, Reg and others who absolutely no doubt in my mind, some people can be very successful with roll-ups, certainly. But I think people throw those terms around a little bit too loosely, and it saps their credibility.
I totally agree. And I was talking to Emily, I can't remember her last name offhand, but she's one of the principals of Permanent Capital, Brent Beshore's firm. And she was talking about roll-ups. And like, what really hit me is just the level of operational and financial sophistication a good roll-up needs, and even then it might not succeed. But she was talking about something like, people told them to roll up swimming pool construction companies or something like that. And she was like, yeah, but we look into it. Turns out permitting is different in every single jurisdiction, right? And what you have to do. So you get no economies of scale there. And then the industry already has purchasing groups. So anything you could get out of like collective purchasing discounts is gone. And so she's like, then there's no roll up, right? And it's like, oh yeah, did anybody actually go and do that? Like, hey, we could actually get these kind of like model that and actually understand it. I think 95% of the people talking about it have never even thought about that. So
Agreed. Yeah, you got to be thoughtful.
So tell me a little bit about your experience in private equity and the contrast with actually owning.
Yeah. So I think private equity to me, so I went back and forth. I round tripped a couple of times with regards to sell side and buy side in middle market. And my first stop on private equity again was very early on when I was working with that private equity firm and the family office. And my final stop in private equity was working with a firm out of Seattle. And it was a challenging experience, just being very direct about it. It was coming out of 08, 09, which had its own set of challenges. But there was a difference, I think. It was, how do I word this eloquently and yet accurately at the same time? I don't think that I necessarily looked at deals completely the same way that the folks who were writing the checks, right? The folks on investment committee were looking at deals, number one. Number two, though, more importantly, and this actually does relate to Watershed. This is one of the things that I embrace passionately about Watershed. I think I did a really crappy job when it came to persuasion and negotiation internally at that firm. And understanding how you had to sell effectively to investment committee to get things done, understanding the importance of selling to business owners, that you were the best buyer of that deal. These were things I don't think I did a particularly good job at, just being very direct about it. So it's funny that when I look at the pain of that experience, but apply those lessons to my life now, owning a negotiations training company, I've been able to incorporate a lot of those learnings into what we're doing at Watershed, which I think is tremendously valuable to our clients. So it was a very interesting time in the market. Again, coming out of the great financial crisis, I think that there was a lot of weirdness that was happening in the private equity market generally in terms of multiples and deal structures, et cetera. And there was a lot of fear. And you really wanted to be extra cautious. And I think that's another area where I think I struggled a little bit was you absolutely did not want to screw up because there had been so much carnage coming out of the GFC that for me, I think that led to some analysis paralysis at times, which is something else that I've talked about on Twitter.
Now, I would say private equity is probably in another period of crisis currently. I mean, I think there's been a lot of data coming out about, vintages in the last few years have not been paying cash out. And, they obviously bought way high. And then, they got the high rates now. So it's harder to lever up deals, it's more expensive. And the market is still crowded with people. So I think probably in contrast to the GFC, there was like this massive downdraft, right? And then this opportunity to buy afterwards. I just don't feel like we've had that, right? So we have this long kind of grinding cycle where value, they're still saying that the marks are this and they're not, right? The public market equivalents are down 30, 40%. And just strikes me that we're in for this like slow moving disaster for private equity over the next 4 or 5 years.
Well, Alan, what's interesting about that is there were some funds, and I won't name names, but there were funds coming out of GFC that for all intents and purposes were walking dead. They had carnage throughout their portfolios. The chances of them being able to raise another fund were slim to none. But because in the grand scheme of things, the GFC did not last a super long period of time, at least relative to the life of a private equity firm, those PE firms, even the walking deads, were able to rehabilitate themselves in a lot of different ways coming out of the GFC. And in certain cases, again, not naming names, not only were they able to recover, but they were able to go out there and raise substantially larger funds. If you look at how slowly this trouble in the market, to your point, is moving now, I think it's a very different dynamic. Also, the market is so much more saturated, so much more efficient. They bought at such incredibly lofty ZERP multiples. There's a lot of factors coming together, including ongoing succession issues at a lot of these firms as well, that I think are going to be very problematic. So I wholeheartedly concur. I think private equity is in a crisis moment right now.
Eventually, like my theory, this is my theory, so take it for what it's worth. But I think we are in a long-term cycle of higher and more variable inflation, right? And that that doesn't mean it has to be 10%, but it's not going to be going. And my take is the entire private equity industry was invented during a period of decreasing rates, and so even though they were higher than they are now at the beginning of that period, they were on their way down. So that made every year you held a company, it got cheaper, right? And now it's not going to be that way. So I just wonder, like small business owners, we, as you maybe mentioned earlier, we might be a little contemptuous of private equity, right? But to be honest, they're one of the top exit options for us. So I wonder what happens. Like, are we going to see a decrease in multiples because, first of all, the rates are going to be higher. Second of all, private equity is going to be harder to raise going forward?
I have no doubt. This is where I do want to be careful about coming across as being uber bearish, because I have been uber bearish for quite some time and I've been a fool. I will say that at some point in time, the law of economic physics will prevail. Very Muskian in that respect, right? The only laws that are not malleable are the laws of physics. And I think the same ultimately will apply to economics as well, for wonky reasons we don't need to get into. But I do think ultimately you are going to see multiples contract. I think you're right. For all intents and purposes, you've had a 30-year run where when you're buying a company, you can basically expect that 30 to 40% of your return is going to come from multiple arbitrage, simply because there's a negative correlation between interest rates and multiples. So rates go down, multiples go up. And that's just historically been the way it's always worked. And I think that will end up happening here as well, even though we haven't necessarily seen it yet. In an illiquid market, and we are in the ultimate of illiquid markets, it takes time for these corrections to happen. I think to a certain extent you see that in housing. You certainly see that in alternatives, but certainly private equity specifically. So I do think that people should be concerned about where private equity is going to go. Now, granted, I speak for myself. My business is small enough that there will always be private equity buyers or portfolio companies who I think could tuck in a company like mine if I ever decided to sell. But I do think having a healthy private equity market is really important. But I will say this, and this does relate to a broader political dynamic that we're all facing now as well, left or right. Populism is on the rise, and private equity is increasingly in the crosshairs of those political conversations also. And so we can talk about interest rates, we can talk about a lot of these different structural things happening in the market, but to a certain extent, it might be the political aspects that might be the darkest cloud of them all.
So I'm trying to get a guy on the podcast here named Russell Clark. He's a former hedge fund manager from England. And he's been talking a lot about this. And he sees largely politics is always behind it, but it was largely from the 80s on, you had this sort of pro-corporate mentality, right? With globalization, immigration, tax policy, blah, blah, blah. And so he sees that that's now shifting in multiple countries across the world. And so don't want to get too political, but some people say that, we're running industrial policy for broadband or chips now, right? And then some others would say, hey, we've been running an industrial policy for private capital for the last 45 years, right? With subsidizing it with deductibility of interest and tax, differential tax rates for labor and capital and carried interest. So, in the end, look, there's only so many places you can get blood from the stone. And if we're not going to cut entitlements, they're coming after corporate tax rates at some point. So I do think that the industry is long-term. It's going to be just a shift in the emphasis going forward. And that, again, like you said, it doesn't mean the whole business is gone. But it's going to get much more like, what cash flows can I get in the next couple of years that don't depend on me, debt service to get them. And that's what the game will become.
I think it's like any other asset class. Let's go back and look at the mutual fund business. I mean, to a certain extent, Blackstone is the alternatives version of Fidelity, right? Going way back all this way. And I think there's a lot of maturity that's going to come with it. And ultimately that is going to translate into lower returns for lots of reasons. There's just a lot more noise, a lot more competition, and a lot more transparency, a lot less inefficiency in the market, which is going to drive ultimately returns lower. So finding those spots where you can continue to make above market returns is going to get increasingly difficult. No way around it. Law of economic physics.
Hopefully you didn't buy a bunch of self-storage in 2021, right? So
yeah, I think there's a lot of things that are going to have to flow through the system. I know nothing about the self-storage industry, so I can't comment on that, but there were a lot of very lofty deals that were done that I think are going to take a while to find their way through the snake, and it's not going to be pretty.
Yeah, and it'll take longer in the private markets than it has in public, right? We've seen that. So excellent. Well, Steve, this has been awesome. It's great to hear about, what's going on in the training world and the private equity world. And so if people want to reach out, where's the best place to get you? Is it on Twitter?
Yeah, Twitter, definitely Twitter. I really suck at my DMs though. So it's not like I'm some massive account, but the DMs experience is just so terrible that I just rarely go in there. So yeah,
you got a business to run,
I got a business to run. Exactly. But I am on Twitter all the time. So that is the best place to find me, and just, post a response to something, a reply to something, and I'm sure to hit you up.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, Steve, we appreciate you being on the pod today.
Alan, likewise. Appreciate you having me. This has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the Small Business Mentor podcast, brought to you by Alan Pence. For more insights on how to navigate your business through its black holes, visit @apence on X. Don't forget to search for Small Business Mentor in your podcast app to subscribe. Thank you for joining us, and here's to your next leap in business growth.